9 of New York's most insane unsolved mysteries. 1. The murder of Arnold Rothstein at the Park Central Hotel. Known by many names, A.R., Mr. Big, the Fixer, the Big Bankroll, the Man Uptown, and the Brain, Arnold Rothstein seemed more myth than man. He was Arnold Rothstein, Meyer Wolfsheim in The Great Gatsby, and Nathan Detroit in Guys and Dolls. He was rumored to be the mastermind of the Black Sox scandal, the fixing of the 1919 World Series. Arnold Rothstein was gambling, and Arnold Rothstein was money. He was Mr. Broadway and had his own booth at Lindy's restaurant, in Manhattan, where he held court. Many know about the life of Arnold Rothstein, few know the details of his death. Man reported shot in Park Central Hotel, 7th Avenue and 56th Street. Ambulance dispatched. That was the message recorded at 10:53 p.m. on Sunday, November 4, 1928 by a desk sergeant in Manhattan's West 47th Street station. By midnight, the information had been updated to show that Arnold Rothstein, 46 years old of 912 Fifth Avenue, had been shot in the abdomen, and found near the employees' entrance of the Park Central Hotel. Earlier that evening, Rothstein arrived at Lindy's restaurant on 7th Avenue, and went to his private booth. Lindy's was Rothstein's office. He kept a regular schedule there, and several men were already waiting to see him, when he walked in that night. One of the men, Jimmy Meehan, ran the Park City Club, one of the city's biggest gambling dens during the 1920s. Meehan operated the Plush Club with a bankroll supplied by Rothstein. About 10:15, Rothstein received a telephone call. After a short conversation he hung up, and motioned for Meehan to walk outside with him. "McManus wants to see me at the Park Central," Rothstein said. He then pulled a gun out of his pocket, and handed it to Meehan, saying, "Keep this for me, I will be right back." Meehan then watched Rothstein walk up 7th Avenue. The man who had requested Rothstein's presence at the hotel was George McManus. A bookmaker and gambler, McManus was well connected in the city, with one brother serving on the police force, and another serving as a priest. Several weeks earlier, McManus had hosted a high-stakes poker game in which Rothstein had participated. The game began on September 8, and continued into the morning of September 10. Other players participating in the game were West Coast gambler Nate Raymond, Alvin "Titanic" Thompson, and Joe Bernstein. By the end of the marathon card game, Rothstein was a big loser. He owed Raymond $219,000, Bernstein $73,000, and Thompson $30,000. When Rothstein walked out, without so much as signing an IOU, a couple of the players became irritated. McManus assured the pair, "That's A.R. Hell, he's good for it. He'll be calling you in a couple of days." A week passed and Rothstein had still not made good. Rumors began to circulate that the game was crooked. Rothstein confided to his friend Nicky Arnstein, the husband of actress Fanny Brice, "A couple of people told me that the game was rigged." Arnstein's advice to Rothstein was to pay the players off. "No point to your advertising, you were a sucker." Rothstein held off paying his debt though, hoping to make the gamblers sweat and maybe take a lesser payoff. The players, however, were beginning to pressure McManus since he was the host, and had promised them that Rothstein would make good. McManus sought help from his friend Jimmy Hines of Tammany Hall. Hines, who was also a friend of Rothstein, began to pressure him to clear up the matter. As the weeks passed, the pressure began to get to McManus, who began drinking, and threatened Rothstein for not making good on the debts. On Sunday night, November 4, McManus called Rothstein from room 349, in the Park Central Hotel where he was registered as George Richards. He requested Rothstein to come over right away. The conversation and events that took place after Rothstein arrived are still a mystery. Shortly after Rothstein entered room 349, he was shot once in the lower abdomen. The revolver was then tossed out the window, where it bounced off the hood of a parked taxi and landed in the street. Employees later found Rothstein walking down the service stairs, holding his stomach and asking for a cab to take him home. A police officer soon arrived, summoned an ambulance, and Rothstein was taken to New York's Polyclinic Hospital where he was quickly operated on. The bullet, which was removed, had entered just above the groin and traveled downward, severing an artery. Rothstein had sustained tremendous internal bleeding. When he left the operating room, he was in a coma. Rothstein's two brothers, Jack and Edgar, were summoned to the hospital along with Arnold's wife, Carolyn. Rothstein was given a blood transfusion and morphine for his pain. He regained consciousness Monday morning and told his wife he wanted to go home. During the day, Rothstein signed a will prepared by his attorney and talked with several friends. When questioned by police as to who shot him, he replied, "I'll take care of it myself." Late on Monday afternoon, Caroline was permitted to see him again. He repeated his request to go home and told her, "Don't go away. I don't want to be alone. I can't stand being alone." As he tried to raise himself, he fell back and into unconsciousness. Rothstein would not regain consciousness and died the following morning at approximately 10:20, Election Day, November 6, 1928. Rothstein had bet heavily on the election that year. Had he lived, he would have collected $570,000. His death negated the wagers. In the Jewish tradition, Rothstein was buried the following day in Union Field Cemetery in Queens. Inside the closed casket he was dressed in a white skull cap with a purple striped prayer shawl over a muslin shroud. After Rothstein's shooting, McManus contacted Jimmy Hines, who sent Dutch Schultz associate, Abe Bo Weinberg, to pick him up and hide him. 3 weeks later, McManus arranged for his own arrest in a Broadway barbershop. Although his Chesterfield coat, with his name sewn in it, was found in room 349, no witness could place him in the room at the time of the shooting and he was acquitted. He walked out of the courtroom wearing the overcoat which only minutes before had been tagged as a prosecutor's exhibit. The gamblers who had taken part in the marathon poker game were also arrested. However, they all had ironclad alibis for the night of November 4th and were soon released. In 1940, McManus died of natural causes in Seagirt, New Jersey. Rothstein's murder remains officially unsolved. There has been some speculation over the years that there was more to the murder plot than just the unpaid gambling debts, that other organized crime members wanted to take over Rothstein's lucrative rackets and political connections. It's unlikely, if this were the case, that Rothstein would have only taken one bullet and that in the stomach instead of the head. It is entirely possible that when Rothstein arrived in room 349 he was confronted by a drunken, angry McManus who may have threatened him. When police searched the room they found several empty whiskey bottles. If this were the case, Rothstein could even have been shot accidentally in a struggle with McManus. The Park Central Hotel would later become the Park Sheraton. It would be in the hotel's barber shop on October 25, 1957 that Albert Anastasia would be murdered. In the end, Rothstein was remembered for his cultivation of future organized crime figures Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky, who indeed did take over the Rothstein empire and a legend. 2. The Wall Street Bombing. At the stroke of noon on September 16, 1920, a bomb exploded along Wall Street, killing 38 people and maiming hundreds more. It was the worst terrorist bombing in the United States until the Oklahoma City attack in 1995, the worst in New York until the 9/11 attack on the World Trade Center. The bomb was an immeasurably cruel device, most likely dynamite tied to iron sash weights that acted as shrapnel. It blew people apart where they walked out on a cool, late summer day, tore arms and legs, hands and feet and scalps off living human beings. Others were beheaded or eviscerated, or found themselves suddenly engulfed in flames. Still more injuries were caused by a cascade of broken glass, and the terrified stampede that followed. The bomb's target was presumed to be the House of Morgan, which sat like a blockhouse just across the street from where the explosive had been left in a horse-drawn wagon. The Morgan Bank had emerged from World War I as the single most powerful financial institution in the world, and both the firm and its principals had been under increasing attack, rhetorical and otherwise, ever since it had arranged a huge loan a few years before to help the Allies and keep the Great War going. But the only fatality inside the firm was a 24-year-old clerk. Nearly all the bank's employees were back at their desks the next morning, some of them still bandaged and bruised. The explosion merely pocked the firm's impenetrable, marble walls, the marks defiantly left where they can be seen to this day, the stigmata of capitalism. As with all terrorist attacks, most of the victims were innocent bystanders, messengers, stenographers, clerks, salesmen, drivers, men and women for whom Wall Street was not a grand symbol of American capitalism but a place to make a modest living by selling milk, driving a car, typing reports, recording sales. Only 7 of the dead were over the age of 40. 5 of them were women, 4 of them teenagers. Who would do such a thing? A bevy of the nation's most prominent lawmen and private detectives immediately descended on Wall Street, blaming first anarchists, then paid agents from Lenin's new government in Moscow. But years of investigation yielded nothing, no indictments, no trials, no culprits. No one ever came forward to take responsibility for the crime, or to state what it was supposed to accomplish, and before long it had dropped from public view, lost among the sensations of the racing, giddy 20s. Beverly Gage, a writer and history teacher at Yale, has brought the bombing to life again in her outstanding first book. The Day Wall Street Exploded describes in detail both the bombing itself and the hunt for the perpetrators, but Gage also does us the great good service of placing it in the wider history of industrial warfare that once proliferated in America. Like much of American history, these battles have dropped out of mind because no one wanted to look at them too closely. As Gage points out, the right was loath to discuss the decades of brutal labor and political repression that preceded the Wall Street bombing, the left, to admit that extremists really were willing to resort to violence to overthrow the capitalist order. Between 1881 and 1905 alone, there were more than 37,000 labor strikes in the United States, many of them bloody, bitter struggles. Efforts to unionize were routinely met with clubbings, shootings, jailings, blacklistings and executions, perpetrated not only by well-armed legions of company goons, but also by police officers, deputies, National Guardsmen and even regular soldiers. Dozens of workers were killed in these conflicts, at Ludlow in 1914, in the Homestead and Pullman strikes of the 1890s, at Telluride and Cripple Creek and Colorado Springs. Some Unionists, seeing the state aligned with the employers, struck back with dynamite, invented in 1866 and readily available at American construction sites. In Idaho, in 1905, a bomb ripped the legs off Governor Frank Stenberg in his own front yard, after he stuck 1,000 miners from the Coeur d'Alene strike in makeshift jails for months without trial. 21 men died when labor radicals blew up the rabidly anti-union Los Angeles Times building in 1910. Relatively few workers were involved in such outrages, but millions did turn to the Socialist Party and the far-left industrial workers of the world, the Wobblies, organizations that promised to sweep away the entire capitalist system. Far from being an era of placid reform, Gage writes, the turn of the century was a moment in which the entire structure of American institutions, from the government to the economy, seemed to be up for grabs, poised to be reshaped by new movements and ideas. A murky underworld developed, one in which some radicals, particularly the small but implacable cells of anarchists, really did plot assassinations and bombings, while companies tried to frame strikers and their leaders with phony bomb plots and other accusations. Things came to a head when America entered World War I and the ostensibly progressive Wilson administration put aside the Constitution, jailing thousands of dissidents and suppressing the anti-war socialists and Wobblies. On June 2, 1919, a new wave of bombs hit in apparent retaliation, including one that wrecked the home of Woodrow Wilson's Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer, who opportunistically used the incident to start the nation's first Red Scare. It became one of the most shameful campaigns in the country's history, with hundreds deported merely on suspicion of having radical proclivities. In perhaps the worst episode, An anarchist named Andrea Salcedo was found dead in his underwear on the sidewalk of Park Row in New York, below a room where the Bureau of Investigation, predecessor to the FBI, had secretly held him for weeks. The feds claimed suicide. Salcedo's family and friends saw murder. 4 months later came the Wall Street bomb. What few clues there were pointed to Salcedo's comrades, members of a particularly ruthless anarchist group called the Galleanisti, named after their founder, Luigi Galleani. But the Red Hunters had done their work too well, having already deported Galleani and many other potential witnesses. Even though the crime was never solved, it had other repercussions. The bungled investigation and its wholesale violation of people's civil liberties, as Gage shows, led to a major housecleaning at the Bureau, which, paradoxically, enabled the rise of the biggest civil liberties violator in American history, J. Edgar Hoover. And the bombing contributed to an atmosphere in which 2 other anarchists, Sacco and Vanzetti, were convicted of murder in a case that would become the great leftist cause of the decade. Over time, the bombings petered out, though organized violence in labor and other disputes continued. Even now, as Gage writes, there remains a tendency to think of violence as an anomaly, something outside the American experience, rather than as one of the many ways that Americans have long carried out their political disputes. 3. The 1964 World's Fair's buried underground home. It's a spacious, secure home that could probably fetch a pretty penny on today's NYC real estate market. The only problem is that no one knows if it still exists. The mystery centers around the underground World Home, a 12,000-square-foot subterranean residence that was built for the 1964 World's Fair at Flushing Meadows Corona Park in Queens. After the fair ended, almost all of the exhibits were ordered to be demolished, but some think that the underground home's creator, Jay Swayze, may have left it intact. After all, why pay exorbitant demolition fees to remove the home when you could just tear down its above-ground pavilion and cover the entrance with some dirt? 50 years later, historians, students and regular Joes with shovels are still asking the question, is it down there? The underground home was the brainchild of Jay Swayze, a Texas home builder with a knack for understanding the fears of the American public. The demand for ultra-secure dwellings and fallout shelters in the wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis spurred Swayze to start the Underground World Home Corporation, and market his product with a full-size model home at the 1964 World's Fair. The 12,000-square-foot home was built inside of a 15-foot ditch near the New York Hall of Science, and was extolled by the Wall Street Journal as a new frontier for family living. Fairgoers willing to pay the admission price of $1 for adults or 50 cents for children could make their way down a staircase into the 10-room residence, but what they stepped into was much more than just a bunker. The underground home's luxurious living room was decked out with a Steinway & Sons piano and a terrace, and a combination of real and fake plants lent the space an airy feel despite its subterranean location. According to the exhibit's souvenir brochure, the view seen through the home's windows could even be dialed up at the occupant's whim. Lighting could also be controlled using the residence's sophisticated lighting system as explained in the pamphlet. Dimmers and a specially designed low-voltage light control system permit a rising sun effect in the kitchen, while a star-filled night blankets the outdoor patio. In addition to the dwelling's luxurious accoutrements, a system called the snorkel allowed air from outside to be filtered into the interior with the ability to regulate temperature, humidity and pressure. According to Underground World Home Corporation, this air filtration system could also be modified to deal with dust, sandstorms and even fallout particles. As for electricity, the home boasted its own 20 kW diesel generator with an automatic, 7-second cut-in in case of outside electrical utility failure, as well as a sewage lift and sewage ejector. With all of the underground home's amenities, it's clear that a great deal of care and attention went into its design. So the $1 million question, or rather the $80,000 question, as that was the house's price tag at the time, is, did Jay Swayze destroy the home after the World's Fair, or is it still there after all these years underneath what is now a soccer field? In 2012, Journalist Nicholas Hirschon took a deeper look into the mystery with his article Is It Down There? The piece chronicled the efforts of people like Dr. Lori Walters, a professor, and Stephen Quinterno, a graduate of Carnegie Mellon University, who believe that the home may still exist below Flushing Meadows Corona Park. Walters, who is a research assistant professor at the Institute for Simulation and Training and Department of History at the University of Central Florida, thinks the modern-day archaeological site is worth looking into as a learning tool. My interest in the underground home stems from its potential to introduce middle school children to urban archaeology, she told us. If we can secure the proper permissions and funding, it can provide children an opportunity to observe and participate in portions of a limited exploration of the site. Walters also pointed out that her goal was not to dig up the site. Ground-penetrating radar would be a non-invasive first step to determine what might remain of the underground structure, she explained. Soil type may not permit us to conclusively determine the structure's existence. The goal is not to uncover the underground home nor to provide full access to it. The greatest extent of exploration would be through an endoscopic camera, and should that reveal an interior that is traversable, I am proposing a small robotic device that the children could navigate and explore. In each step, children could learn about robotics and the science behind the archaeology techniques, in addition to discovering the history of underground homes, the 1964-1965 New York World's Fair and 1960s America. 4. The American Museum of Natural History Jewel Heist. On the night of October 29, 1964, 3 young Americans from Miami, Florida, made the national headlines in what America called the jewel heist of the century. The target was a jewel collection taken from the American Museum of Natural History in New York, founded by legendary banker and avid gemstone collector, John Pierpont, J.P. Morgan. Morgan was actually the founder of the American Museum of Natural History as well as the Wadsworth Atheneum Museum of Art in his hometown of Hartford, Connecticut. In 1900, J.P. Morgan commissioned Tiffany's renowned gemologist, George Frederick Kunz, to help put together the 2,176-piece J.P. Morgan Tiffany jewel collection. The impressive collection consisted of many of the world's finest gemstone specimens. The following year, in 1901, the collection of jewels was donated to the American Museum of Natural History by J.P. Morgan. On October 29 of 1964, 24 jewels from that priceless collection were taken. At the time, the heisted jewels were valued at over $400,000, which would be equal to well over $3 million today. Luckily, the trio who pulled off the jewel heist of the century did not succeed in taking the entire collection, but the jewels they did take happened to include some of the finest in the set. Some of the most notable pieces taken during the heist included the Star of India, a near-flawless 563.35-carat grayish-blue star sapphire, mined from Sri Lanka. The Star of India is one of the largest blue star sapphires in the world and is not only admired for its astounding size, but also for its asterism which displays on both sides of its domed Capricorn surface. Also taken from the museum was the Eagle Diamond, a 16.25-carat diamond discovered in Eagle, Wisconsin, and the 100.32 DeLong Star Ruby, a remarkable Burmese ruby first discovered in the 1930s. Fortunately, both the Star of India and the DeLong Star Ruby were recovered, along with a handful of other jewels taken that day, from a Miami bus depot locker. However, the Eagle Diamond was never found. Sadly, it is believed that the large, historically important Eagle Diamond was cut down into smaller pieces and later resold. All 3 of the jewel thieves were apprehended by police just 2 days after the heist. A local Florida surfer, Jack Rolland Murphy, known as Murph the Surf, was the leader of the robbery. His 2 accomplices, Alan Dale Kuhn and Roger Frederick Clark, were arrested with him. All 3 were sentenced to 3 years behind bars for their crime. Richard Duncan Pearson, who played a role in hiding and ransoming the DeLong Star Ruby, was also eventually caught and convicted. He served a 10-year sentence, a longer term than the 3 boys combined. So just how did 3 young beach boys make off with the 24 of the world's most valuable jewels? Well, As Murph the Surf put it, they got lucky that the security at the museum was almost non-existent at the time of the planned heist. After casing the place out, the trio learned that the building's alarm system wasn't working properly and that the museum staff usually kept a window open on the second story for ventilation. To make things even easier for the jewel thieves, they later discovered during the robbery that the alarms on the display weren't operational. It was later reported that the museum security guards didn't make proper routine rounds that evening, so the display of jewels remained unwatched for hours, giving the boys plenty of time to get in and out without getting caught, at the scene of the crime that is. After their getaway, the boys traded some of the jewels with some Miami locals for a $30,000 loan. After checking into a luxury Miami hotel, they began to spend their money lavishly, which raised suspicion. A hotel busboy tipped them off to the Miami police after news of the jewelry heist hit the headlines, and it wasn't long before the three of them were apprehended. If the boys had kept a low profile and had not given themselves away by their excessive spending, they very well could have got away with the jewelry heist of the century. Of the 24 jewels taken that day, only 10 of the most valuable were returned. The other 14 jewels taken the night were never recovered and are still missing. 5. The Lost Eagles of Pennsylvania Station. The obliteration of the McKim, Mead and White designed Pennsylvania Station in 1963, just a half-century after its completion, helped galvanize grassroots preservation efforts that eventually led to New York City Mayor Robert F. Wagner signing the Landmarks Law on April 19, 1965. Saving Place, 50 Years of New York City Landmarks, an exhibition at the Museum of the City of New York, chronicles the influence of that legislation on the development of the city in the second half of the 20th century and the first decade of the 21st. The show also goes back to the emergence of historic preservation in the U.S. in the 19th century when, in 1845, poet Walt Whitman mourned the country's pull down and build over again spirit. Now, 50 years after the passage of the Landmarks Law, there are 1,347 individual protected landmarks across New York City's 5 boroughs. Saving Place, curated by Donald Albrecht, the museum's curator for architecture and design, and Andrew S. Stolkart, director of the Historic Preservation Program at Columbia University, features architectural fragments and scale models of reuse and restoration projects on 2 long tables, which are surrounded by a timeline of preservation on the walls of the gallery. From the 1910 marble eagle head sculpted by Adolph A. Weinman and plucked from the Penn Station wreckage, to a model of the glass skyscraper Norman Foster beautifully perched atop the 1928 Hearst Building in 2006, the exhibition mourns the loss of architectural treasures while celebrating adaptive reuse and the ways historic sites can contribute to growth rather than slowing it down. As a Jane Jacobs quote from her 1961 book The Death and Life of Great American Cities reminds visitors, cities need old buildings so badly it is probably impossible for vigorous streets and districts to grow without them. However, the exhibition doesn't go into too much detail on how landmarks have propelled growth, contrasting instead what was torn down before the Landmarks Law was passed with what has been protected since. New York hasn't experienced a preservation failure as monumental as Penn Station since the adoption of the Landmarks Law. The exhibition illustrates the law's power in a 1967-69 Marcel Breuer proposal to overwhelm the facade of Grand Central Terminal with the base of a new tower. The drawings for the failed project are on view for the first time since it was rejected. It remains a staggering task for a small commission to manage thousands of historic sites and, as the New York Times pointed out in April, landmarks preservation has one of the smallest budgets of any city agency. Back in December, there was outcry when a commission proposed stripping almost 100 sites of landmark status consideration to streamline the agency's backlog. The agency rightly withdrew the plan, but it was a sign of how difficult the city's historic sites are to protect, preserve, and promote, especially with better-funded real estate developers always encroaching from all sides. Important and beloved buildings continue to fall, the Harlem Renaissance Ballroom this year, the Pan Am Worldport in 2013, The Frank Lloyd Wright-designed Park Avenue showroom, also in 2013. Saving Place demonstrates how essential the landmarks law was and is for protecting New York's history and promoting it as a vital part of the city's future. Dutch architectural photographer Rewan Ben was brought on to take photographs of the landmarked sites for both the exhibition and its accompanying book, and in both these presentations the buildings are active in their urban context, not closely framed as stranded relics of the past. Saving Place is a compact exhibition and favors mentioning briefly as many sites as possible rather than spending more time on one place. Even the stunning demolition of Penn Station just gets a corner. That can make the exhibition a bit cluttered, a feeling emphasized by the huge, box-shaped photographic panoramas hanging from the ceiling. However, seeing so much of what was lost and saved at once is powerful. There are almost forgotten near misses like the proposed replacement of Carnegie Hall with a red ceramic-paneled skyscraper monolith in 1959, and a litany of destruction including St. John's Chapel, the Broca Mansion, and the Roxy. There are also vital victories like the conversion of the Jefferson Market Courthouse into a library. Writer Ada Louise Huxtable, a huge influence on preservation, stated at the time of Penn Station's fall, "We will probably be judged not by the monuments we built but by those we have destroyed." New York will never be a static city. On any given day it has over 100 miles of scaffolding shadowing its sidewalks, and pending construction like the massive Nordstrom Tower, which at 1,775 feet, is set to be the tallest residential building in the world, will radically alter the skyline. Preservation will thus always be an issue, and retracing the last 50 years of its successes and failures can help prepare its advocates for the battles ahead. 6. The lost locomotive in the Atlantic Avenue Tunnel. With continued silence from the dot, we are dead in the water, with the potential of a major historical find right under our feet in Brooklyn. Earlier this month, Bob Diamond, who is responsible for rediscovering the old Atlantic Avenue Tunnel back in the 1980s, where he was allowed to give tours until the FDNY shut him down, shared a series of internal emails between employees at the National Geographic Channel. The above sentence is pulled from the channel's former VP of Development, Bill Margall, and hits the root of the issue. There is something of historical significance under a street in Brooklyn, which experts could easily get to, but it's been enshrouded in red tape. A few years ago, the Nat Geo team started working on a project in which they hoped to film the big reveal of an old 1830s drain believed to be underneath Atlantic Avenue, in an unexplored and currently inaccessible part of the tunnel Diamond had found. Other things that could be down there include John Wilkes Booth's diary, which may reveal who hired him to shoot Abraham Lincoln. Historical novelist G.J.A. O'Toole wrote in his 1979 detective thriller The Cosgrove Report that the missing pages of the assassin's journal were hidden in a steel box under Atlantic Avenue, next to a lost steam locomotive. So the Nat Geo program was going to be like when Geraldo Rivera opened Al Capone's vaults, but more successful. But you've never seen this program because almost immediately after they all but confirmed the locomotive's existence, the NYC shut them down. The channel's Bill Margall also wrote in the aforementioned emails, "We found a signature of a large metal object, about the size of a locomotive, exactly where our sources and historical information predicted it would be." As you can imagine, this was an amazing find and word quickly leaked to the press. This angered Seth Solomon and he effectively shut down all access to the tunnel, at which point our production was officially put on hold. That was in 2011, and there has been no progress since, except for Diamond's fruitless attempts at cutting through the red tape. The reason the mystery remains a mystery seems to come down to a series of grudges. The Dot has never liked Bob Diamond much, and Margall at Nat Geo called Diamond mercurial, at best in these emails. Diamond, who recently filed a lawsuit against Nat Geo, sent out the emails to press, declaring that they contain a full written confession from Bill Margall admitting, "Nat Geo caused Dot to shut down our tunnel." He told us today that his lawsuit against them has served to get their attention. They've indicated through their attorneys that they are willing to settle with us. They have also mentioned that they feel bad, because they already spent over $100,000 on a show that never came off. Diamond is requesting reasonable compensation for a loss of tunnel tour income for the last 5 years, and that Nat Geo join with BHRE to reproach, unveil the locomotive to the public, help underwrite the cost of improving access to the tunnel, and finish the show. Diamond tells us he's written numerous letters to Polly Trottenberg, and Mayor de Blasio asking for a meeting to try and get this project back on the rails. The only answer we ever got is a form letter generated by the mail office at The letter basically says, "No comment." He added that the only thing stopping us from going back into the tunnel is the Of course, we're glad to also work with FDNY to address any safety concerns they may have regarding the tour groups. In 2011, our professionally licensed civil engineer prepared a plan for greatly improving access and egress to the tunnel, which wouldn't cost too much money. At the time, we submitted the plan to the but never got an answer. According to the Daily News, Department of Transportation PR man Seth Solomino pulled the plug on the project in part because leaks in the press and Diamond's lawsuit cast the agency as the bad guy. Noting that in a 2011 discussion with Nat Geo's Pam Wells, Solomino declared, "If people from the channel want to call me, they'll simply be hearing me yell at them, and then I'll make sure the film will never happen." With the being cast as the bad guy by Bob Diamond, we cannot, at this point, allow National Geographic access to the tunnel. Let me make it clearer. Do not call us. We will call you. 7. The cow tunnels of New York City. In the late 19th century, there were some 2 million cows being herded in the streets of New York City. It's long been rumored that underground cow tunnels were created to ease the congestion, but evidence, archaeological or otherwise, has been hard to come by and exact locations have not been verified. The Big Apple is an epic place filled with all manner of stories that contain varying degrees of truth and folklore. Over the years, many dedicated investigators have uncovered the fact behind many of NYC's most baffling urban legends. But doing so isn't always easy, and some legends are hard to crack. Gizmodo took a stab at deciphering the truth behind one such tale, which writer Nicola Twilley stumbled upon in the book Raising Stakes. Written by Betty Fussell, the book examined how the beef industry shaped early American history. According to Fussell, livestock traffic around the meatpacking district of Manhattan was all but unbearable, so a tunnel was dug beneath 12th Avenue to move cattle from the docks to the city's slaughterhouses. It seems plausible enough. Yet for a long time, there was no confirmation on whether or not the cattle tunnels actually existed. Then, in 1997, mystery writer Brian Wyperud published an article in the Tribeca Trib highlighting his efforts to find the mysterious tunnels. Wyperud claimed the tunnels were large, well-preserved structures that endured in the gloomy world beneath Manhattan. But any solid evidence for such a grand subterranean structure remains sketchy, and enigmatic lost tunnels make for popular urban legends in many cities across the world. Eventually, the findings of a 2004 study were released by city planners. The documents appeared to reveal that there were, indeed, old cow tunnels under 12th Avenue, at 34th and 39th Street, which had been built between 1928 and 1930. Presumably abandoned sometime thereafter, their existence was forgotten with the passing decades. Gizmodo dug deeper, but again found evidence for the tunnel's continued existence was lacking. Yet old city maps showed eerie names such as Abattoir Place and reference to an offal dock, and revealed that the area around 39th Street had been packed with slaughterhouses, bone boilers and other grim-sounding relics of the past. Finally, Twilley contacted Historical Perspectives, Incorporated, and obtained 1930s-era blueprints apparently proving that a cow tunnel had indeed been built by Pennsylvania Railroad, beneath 12th Avenue at West 38th Street. Finally, the mysterious New York cattle tunnel seemed to be real. But no one knows whether it's still there, and no archaeological survey has yet proven or debunked its existence. For now, New York's abandoned cow tunnels remain an intriguing mystery. echoing a cityscape that has changed dramatically over the decades. What's more, major infrastructure projects like the Lincoln Tunnel make it hard to imagine that a long-forgotten livestock tunnel could survive intact, and tales of eerie time capsules haunting the urban underworld make for compelling urban legends. As Gizmodo writes, "Perhaps the cow tunnels represent the city's agricultural unconscious, returning in the form of rumor and legend, the lost slaughterhouses of Manhattan, haunting the imagination of the city long after the last odors of large rendering and puddles of blood have been cleaned away." 8. The Lost Bogardus Building. A building that once stood in downtown New York City in the Washington Market area was stolen not once, but twice in its history. The area was targeted for urban renewal in the 1960s, but because the Bogardus Building, also known as the Edward Lying Stores, was one of the first cast iron buildings in the city, the Landmarks Preservation Commission decided to save it and reintegrate it into a new building. It was taken down in parts, catalogued, and stored in a vacant lot. On June 25, 1974, Beverly Moss Batt, chairman of the Landmarks Preservation Commission, reportedly ran into the press room at City Hall announcing, "Someone has stolen one of my buildings." The building contractor had discovered 3 men loading large pieces onto a truck and got the license plate. The police caught the perpetrators, who had stolen 2/3 of the facade and sold it as scrap. 22 broken pieces were found in a Bronx junkyard. The rest of the panels were then designated to be included in a building at the South Street Seaport. The Landmarks Preservation Commission moved them to a secret location in a city-owned building on 52nd Street, just off 10th Avenue. When architects went to measure the pieces with the commission in June 1977, the hidden storage unit was empty. 9. The Cornerstone of St. Patrick's Cathedral. Much is known about the cornerstone of St. Patrick's Cathedral. As the Archdiocese of New York embarks on the 5-year, $175 million renovation of what has been described as the nation's largest Roman Catholic Gothic sanctuary, architects and historians have meticulously reviewed every detail of James Renwick Jr.'s original blueprint. They have learned that the cornerstone was hand-cut by Cormac McCall, a 22-year-old Irish immigrant. It was laid on Sunday, August 15, 1858, the Feast of the Assumption, by John Hughes, New York's first archbishop. 200 priests and 100 choirboys marched in the formal procession. The throng of onlookers was so thick, 100,000 strong, by one estimate, that all the city's streetcars were diverted north to accommodate the crowd. Downtown Manhattan was described as depleted. The stone was left open for offerings from the public. It was sealed exactly 2 years later, on August 15, 1860. Much has been learned about the cornerstone, except for 2 salient details: where it is and when it went missing. "It's the great mystery of the cathedral," said Monsignor Robert T. Ritchie, St. Patrick's rector. The cathedral was conceived by Archbishop Hughes, who presciently anticipated the development of Midtown Manhattan, as more than merely a replacement for the old St. Patrick's downtown on Mott Street. In the History of the Archdiocese of New York, Monsignor Thomas J. Shelley wrote that the new cathedral was meant to be a statement in stone of the Catholic presence in a city that was then the capital of Protestant America. Many cornerstones are prominently marked with the date construction began. Some identify the builder or architect. Most are in plain sight, appropriately enough, at a corner of the building. Not so at St. Patrick's. "I have no idea where it is," Monsignor Ritchie said. "Actually, there is a vague idea. We know it was at 50th Street and 5th Avenue, but exactly where nobody knows," said Thomas G. Young, the author of several books about the cathedral. "It was in none of the plans we found," he said. "I once found a photograph when the building was 8 or 12 feet high and there was a block missing. I often wondered if that was an opening that led to the cornerstone below it, but it was probably too high. Scaffolding has already been erected around the cathedral, though whether the cornerstone will be rediscovered during the renovations is uncertain. We're still in the early stages of planning the restoration, and it's very early to determine exactly how the time frame, and other particulars will look," said Kate Monahan, a spokeswoman for the Archdiocese. The cornerstone laying ceremony on a glorious August day, in 1858 was an affirmation of the city's evolving demography. No religious pageant of equal pomp could have been experienced on this continent before, Mr. Young wrote, and the effect on the people was stunning. A wooden canopy covered the spot where the cornerstone was to be laid. Archbishop Hughes spoke from a flag-bedecked platform nearby. Those among the largely Irish immigrant crowd who were close enough to hear his lengthy remarks were delighted to learn that the new cathedral would be named for St. Patrick, the Apostle of Ireland. After ritually blessing the cornerstone, Archbishop Hughes placed it in the foundation. It contained a parchment litany in Latin of ecclesiastical and government officialdom and a celebratory news report on the recent laying of the first Atlantic cable, heralding instantaneous communication with the continent from which so many of New York's immigrant Catholics hailed. The cavity in the cornerstone was left unsealed temporarily to accommodate offerings from ordinary citizens, but it is unclear whether they constituted financial contributions or sentimental relics. The cathedral's foundation was built with Maine granite. The marble walls were quarried in Westchester County. While the original plans called for steps at 5th Avenue, there are 7 now at the East 50th Street corner. It is also unclear whether any alteration of the street elevation after 1858 might have obscured the cornerstone. The cathedral was finally consecrated in 1879. According to one account, the cornerstone was not marked and the walls were built above it, perhaps suggesting it is below grade. Other versions of that theory abound. One theory is that the cornerstone might have been dislodged, or moved later during construction of the Lady Chapel at the cathedral's eastern exposure. A detailed historical guide published in 1931 suggests the craggy foundation cornerstone was not the kind of granite that yields easily, if at all, to the sculptor's chisel. There must have been some temporary reason for omitting the inscription, since it is claimed the surface could be smoothed. Either at that time, or afterward, the guidebook's author continued, an almost invisible square was clipped off the lower east end of the stone above, and that one is sometimes taken for the foundation stone. Wonders me, who made this cut, and why. The day after the 1858 ceremony, the New York Times reported that the Archbishop sprinkled the stone with holy water, and with a knife marked on each side of it the sign of the cross. In 1860, Archbishop Hughes announced that construction would be delayed because donations had been depleted, and the delays continued because of the Civil War. He wrote that the names of 73 donors in addition to 103 original donors would be deposited in the cornerstone, and the wall built over it to the average height of the other portions of the structure, which was then about 10 feet. Then he added mysteriously, of course, on a list of subscribers that is to remain outside of the cornerstone, the names only of those who shall have paid can be inscribed. As for the other donors' names, Archbishop Hughes said, though unseen by men, they will ever be under the eyes and inspection of God, and may turn up for honor and mercy on the day of judgment. For whatever motivation, he envisioned that unlike traditional time capsules, this one would never be discovered. For 151 years, he has been correct. The noble impulse that actuated the primary patrons of the new cathedral, he wrote, are entitled to the respect of being incorporated and recorded in the cornerstone, which, in all probability, will never be disturbed by human agency.